عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. رح نبدأ اليوم إن شاء الله موضوع جديد chapter 4 اللي هو تطبيقات على الديريفاتيف. تعلمتوا قبل how you can find the derivative for polynomial, for exponential function, sine inverse, cosine inverse, logarithmic function. Now in this chapter we will study application of the derivative. So we start of analysis of function, section 4.1 and 4.2. In this lecture, we will define what do we mean about a critical point, and also we will define what do we mean about increasing, decreasing function, and also what do we mean about relative extremum, that means max or minimum. So our aim in this lecture to define three concepts. What do we mean about a critical point, increasing, decreasing function, and the relative max minimum. So definition: a number C belongs to domain f x. فأهم شرط إنه هذا الرقم belongs to domain f x is a critical number for f x إذا تحقق أحد الشرطين، إما f prime let's c equal 0 or f prime let's c does not exist. So to find the critical points for the function, the critical point must belong to the domain f x. فإذا كانت الدerivative equals 0 or f prime does not exist, then c is a critical point. For example, find the critical numbers for. If you want to find the critical point, you must find the x coordinate and the y coordinate. Now, if we take the function f x 1 over x, before you find the critical number, what is the domain for f x? The domain for f x are except 0. Now, to find the critical numbers, you must find f prime lel x. Now, f prime lel x, how you can differentiate 1 over x? The derivative for 1 over x minus 1 over x squared. Now, to find the critical points, when the derivative equals 0, it will be never equal 0. هل من الممكن إنه f prime equals 0? No. So, f prime لل x, it will be never equal 0. The function not differentiable at x equals 0 but x equals 0 not a critical point لسبب أنها لا تنتمي للدومين. So we say f x has no critical point. No critical points. If we take another example, f x equal x to the power 1 over 3. Before you solve the problem, what is the domain for this function? The domain for f x are a real number. Why? This is the cubic root for x. So if it is positive or negative, حيكون له output. To find the critical points, you must find f prime لل x. Now f prime لل x, حسب الرولز للاشتقاق we differentiate x to the power 1 over 3 equal 1 over 3 x to the power 1 over 3 minus 1. So this equivalent to 1 over 3 x to the power 1 over 3 minus 1 minus 2 over 3. This equivalent to 1 over 3 x to the power 2 over 3. obvious f prime never equals 0. مستحيل إنها المشتقة تساوي صفر. لكن obvious إنه f x is not differentiable at x equals 0. with 0 belongs to domain f. So we conclude إنه 0 0 هي عبارة عن critical point. Why 0 0 is a critical point for the function f x? Why? Since f prime للزيرو does not exist لأنها صفر المقام, with 0 belongs to domain f x. If you take the function f x equal the absolute value of x, واضح الدومين ل f x r. If you want to find f prime لل x, f prime لل x equal إما 1 if x greater than 0 and minus 1 if x less than 0, and if x equals 0 the function not differentiable, or f prime less 0 does not exist. So what is the critical point for f x? obvious هي 0 لأنه الكريتيكال point تحقق إحدى الشرطين، إما f prime less c equals 0 or f prime less c does not exist or the function not differentiable. So we get 0 0 is a critical point for the function f x. Now the critical numbers for f x equal the square root x minus 1 for x minus 2 to the power 3 are. هذا homework بعطيك خيارات. Before you find the critical numbers, you must find the domain for this function. What is the domain for this function? The domain from 1 to infinity. So any critical number must belong to this interval. To find the critical numbers for this function, you must differentiate. You have a product of two functions. حاول إنك differentiate and find the critical number. I think the answer it will be A. Okay. So until now we define what do we mean about a critical point or a critical number. Now, consider this graph f x. If you take any 2 points, this is x1 and this is x2. Obvious x1 less than x2. This point x1 if x1 and this point x2 if x2. What is the relation between fx1 and fx2? واضح إنه fx1 less than fx2. That means when x increase, الإيمج it will be increase. يعني this function increasing. This function increasing function. Okay, if you take the graph for this function, take any 2 point. هي x1 وهي x2. واضح إنه x1 less than x2. لكن what is the relation between fx1 and fx2? This point x1 fx1 and this point x2 fx2. When x increase, the image decrease. واضح from the graph إنه fx1 greater than fx2. فهذا الفانكشن رح نعطي عليه اسم إنه decreasing. لكن in one, obvious, when the x increase, the image it will be increased. So this function رح نعطي اسم it will be increasing function. Now, look to the graph in 3. This is x1, this is x2. When x1 and x2 are increased, لاحظ إنه it will be constant. They have the same image. So this function is constant function, not increasing and not decreasing. معناته we will define what do we mean about increasing function and decreasing function. في التعريف الأول, what do we mean about increasing? If x1 less than x2, for any x1 and x2 in domain F, then fx1 less than fx2. So خلينا نشوف الديفينيشن. So definition, let F be defined on interval and x1, x2 are points in that interval. F is increasing, سوف يكون الفانكشن increasing on the interval if fx1 less than fx2 whenever x1 less than x2. وهذا الكلام اللي شفناه in graph 1. We see that in graph 1. And decreasing x1 less than x2, then fx1 greater than fx2. So fx decreasing on the interval if fx1 greater than fx2 whenever x1 less than x2. And the function is constant on the interval if fx1 equal fx2 for all points. يعني إذا حاولت إنك you find the images or the images they are equal for all x1 and x2 belongs to the interval Borsa function, or for L, x1 and x2 in the domain. So this is the definition. Now our question, how to find the intervals of increasing and decreasing for the function. نرجع للجراف للاقتران in graph 1. If we draw the tangent at x1, this is the tangent. Now, f prime at x1 من تعريفنا للديريفاتيف f prime للx1 هي تمثل السلوب للتانجنت line. Now the slope of the tangent line at x1 positive or negative? Obvious it is positive. Why? This angle acute angle, so tan positive. فواضح إنه f prime at x1 positive. If you take the slope of a tangent line at any point on the graph, at this point, this is another tangent. Obvious إنه the slope also positive. So the function it will be increasing if f prime positive for any point in domain F. If you draw a tangent line at this point, the tangent line, also the slope it will be positive. Now, look to the graph 2. If we draw a tangent line at any point, if you draw a tangent line at x1, this is the tangent line. So, f prime at x1 represent the slope of a tangent. Now, the slope of a tangent at x1 positive or negative? واضح إنه هاي الانجل التان إلها negative. So, f prime at x1 negative. So the function decreasing if the derivative is negative. Now if you draw any tangent at any point حيكون عندنا السلوب negative. Okay? you draw this tangent line, we see that the slope is negative. Now, recall if f x equal constant c, then f prime x equal 0. So in this graph, if f prime x equals 0 for all x in domain f x, that means f x is constant. So to find the intervals of increasing and decreasing، أكيد ما حنلجأ للتعريف، حيكون في عنا theorem تساعدنا how to find the intervals of increasing and decreasing of a function. So theorem: let f be a function that is continuous in a closed interval AB. إذا لم تعطى لك فترة, so you must find the domain for the function and differentiable on the open interval AB. So how to find the interval of increasing and decreasing? First of all, you study the sign to find the intervals of increasing and decreasing. You study the sign for f prime x. Now, if f prime x positive for all value of x in AB, إذا كانت الساين ل f prime positive, that mean إنه السلوب للتangent line positive, then we say f x increasing. وإذا كانت الساين negative for every value of x in AB, then f is decreasing. وإذا كانت f prime للx equals 0 for all value of x in the interval AB, then f is constant. For example, find the intervals on which f is increasing, the intervals on which f is decreasing, and the critical points. Before you solve the question, first of all, you must find the domain. Now, we have the function f x equal 5 minus 4x minus x squared. This is polynomial. What is the domain for polynomial? Obvious, the domain for f x are a real number. To answer the question, you must find f prime and study the sign for f prime of x. Now, خلينا نشتق. f prime للx equal مشتقة ال 5 0 minus 4 minus 2x equal 0. ومنها minus 2x equal 4. So we get x equal minus 2. And minus 2 belongs to domain f x. So we get the critical point. The critical point. What is the critical point? Minus 2 and f minus 2. I hope إنك find f minus 2. How you find f minus 2? You substitute instead of x minus 2, 5 minus 4 times minus 2 minus 4. This equivalent to 5 plus 8 minus 4. This is equal minus 4 equal 9. So we find the critical point. Now to find the interval of increasing and decreasing, we study the sign. بدنا ندرس الساين ل f prime للx. Now the sign for f prime للx minus 2. If you choose number greater than minus 2 like minus 1, إيش رح تكون عنا الساين؟ minus 4 minus 2 times minus 1 plus 2 معناته الإشارة negative. And if you choose number less than minus 2 مثل السالب 4 minus 4 substitute you get minus 4 minus 2 عوض لو اخترنا الماينس 4 شو الساين رح تكون minus 4 minus 2 minus 4 this equivalent minus 4 2 minus 4 plus 8 so sign positive. هذا شو عم بيعنينا this means this function increasing in this interval and decreasing from 2 to infinity. So if x increasing on minus infinity minus 2 closed and if x decreasing on which interval 2 minus 2 infinity. And it has a critical point. لاحظ function increasing decreasing في هون value هاي الفاليو رح تكون هي تمثل للفانكشن relative max. حنحكي عنها later on. Now if you take the function f x equal tan inverse x before you solve what is domain f x? Obvious domain f x are. How we can differentiate tan inverse x? Not according to the rules of differentiation we take d by dx for tan inverse g x هي عبارة عن g prime x over 1 plus gx square. Recall that من rules of differentiation. Now f prime x equal 1 over 1 plus x square. The derivative never it will be equal 0. That means the function has no critical point. And the sign for f prime always positive for all x belongs to R. What does it mean? شو بيعني لك إنه f prime always positive? That mean f x increasing always increasing on its domain on R. Is this function has any critical point? No. Why? Since f prime never equals 0 لاحظ إنه denominator مستحيل يكون صفر. That means f x has no critical point. Another example, if you take the function f x equal x في e to the power x squared, what is the domain for this function? The domain for f x are. Now to find the critical points, the intervals of increasing and decreasing, you must differentiate. Now f prime of x, لاحظ product of two functions. So if you find the derivative x الأول في الديريفاتيف ل e to the power x square 2x الديريفاتيف للباور plus e to the power x square times the derivative of x equal 1. So this equivalent 2. So how we differentiate product of two function? الأول x في الديريفاتيف لهذا الفانكشن مشتقة الباور 2x في الفانكشن نفسه plus e to the power x square times 1. So this equivalent 2. 2x square e to the power x square plus e to the power x square. Now, when the derivative equal 0. So we take e to the power x square as a common factor. 2x square plus 1. هل من الممكن does this equal 0? Impossible. Why? Since e to the power x square does not equal 0 for any value of x, and also 2x square plus 1 does not equal to 0. So, if this function has any critical point, so if x has no critical points. Now, we want to study the sign for f prime x. لاحظ هي f prime للx. f prime للx always positive. Why? e to the power x square positive. 2x square x any number. x square always positive times by 2 positive number. This positive number, if you add 1, you get positive number. So obvious f prime للx always positive. f prime للx always positive for all x belongs to R. This is mean, madam, no, f prime always positive, that mean f x always increasing on its domain on R. Okay. Now, if you take the function f x sin x, in general, the domain sin x R. لكن لو أعطانا في السؤال interval 0 to pi, so بدنا now to find the critical points for the function f x equals sin x, find f prime x. f prime x equal cosine x when it will be equal 0, when x equal pi over 2 and 3 pi over 2. There is another angle cosine equals 0, but we take only the angles that belongs to the interval 0 to pi. So we have the critical points 0, 2 pi, pi over 2 and 3 pi over 2. Now study the sign for f prime x. To study the sign f prime x, 0, 2 pi, pi over 2, 3 pi over 2. If you choose angle between 0 and pi over 2, it will be in the first quadrant, so the cosine positive. If you choose angle between pi over 2 and 3 pi over 2, that means in the second and in the third quadrant, so the cosine negative. And if the angle in the fourth quadrant, the cosine positive. So sine increasing, so f x increasing on which interval? On the interval 0 pi over 2 union 3 pi over 2 and 2 pi. And it will be decreasing from, so increasing, decreasing, increasing. Obvious it will be max and minimum. And the fLx decreasing on which interval? On the interval pi over 2 and 3 pi over 2. And you can find the critical points 0 if 0 pi over 2 if pi over 2, 3 pi over 2 والإيمج إلها and 2 pi الإيمج if 2 pi. We say that our aim in this lecture to define what we mean about relative max and relative minimum. Now look to this graph. This function fLx, so this function decreasing, increasing, this point, local minimum. And the function increasing, decreasing, this point max. And this is local max. Now, what do we mean about local max or local minimum? Now, in this interval, obvious this function decreasing, then increasing, so this value minimum. But this value, it is not the smallest one. For this reason, we say this value local. Now, there is a difference between local and absolute. In this lecture, we defined only what do we mean about local or relative max or minimum. Now, this value, x1, obvious, if x1 is the largest value in this interval, in some open interval containing x1, هاي أكبر قيمة ضمن some open interval contains x1. This point x naught, this point x naught, f x naught. Obvious f x naught أقل أو تساوي f x for all x in some open interval contains x naught. هاي أصغر وحدة ضمن فترة معينة in some open interval contains x naught. And obvious this function decreasing, increasing minimum. Now this function increasing, decreasing this value max until this function has no absolute max. We say absolute max the largest value of the function on its domain. So in this lecture only we define what do we mean about local max or minimum. Now look to this graph. Graph 2. Obvious this function increasing, this function g x, and then decreasing. So this is max. Decreasing and then increasing, this is minimum, local minimum. And this is max. But this is the largest one. We say the largest one, it will be absolute max. Later on, we define what do we mean about absolute. Look to the graph 3. This function always increasing. This function always increasing. So this function has no max and no minimum. If this function, take this graph, we take this function that is defined on a closed interval. In this case, it will be has absolute minimum and absolute max. This case رح نحكي عنها later on في محاضرة قادمة. So, our question now, how to find a local max and a local minimum. If the function decreasing, then it will be increasing, it will be has local minimum. And if the function increasing, that means if prime positive, then it will be decreasing, it will be have a local max. So our question now, how to find a relative extremum. Relative extremum mean إما max or minimum. Before we explain how to find a relative extremum, we define what do we mean about local max and local minimum. So definition, a function f is said to have a relative maximum at x naught. لاحظ this function, this graph has a relative maximum at this point إذا تحقق شرط if there is an open interval containing x naught in which f x naught is the largest value, that is f x naught greater or equal f x for all x in the interval. معناته سوف تكون relative maximum or local maximum if it is fx naught greater than fx for all x in the interval containing for all x in the interval. This interval contains x naught. And we say that a function is said to have a relative or local minimum at x naught. التعريف غيرناه if there is an open interval containing x naught on which fx naught is the smallest, not the largest, the smallest value, that is fx naught less or equal to fx for all x in the interval. This is what we mean about local max minimum. Not relative extremum mean إما relative max or relative minimum. And sometimes instead of relative we say local extremum. That mean إما local max or minimum. Now our question, how to find a relative extremum. We have two methods. الطريقة الأولى by the first derivative test اللي حنشرحها now, and the second method by the second derivative test. Now we will explain what do we mean about first derivative test. الفيرست derivative test تعتمد على إشارة sin f برايم. إذا كان الفانكشن increasing ومن ثم decreasing سوف يكون له local max. So the first derivative test. Suppose that f is continuous at a critical point x naught. If f prime للx positive on an open interval extending left from x naught and f prime للx is negative on an open interval extending right from x naught, then f has relative maximum at x naught. شو معنى هذا الكلام؟ That mean هاي sin x naught هاي sin f prime. You study sin f prime x naught. إذا كان عن يسارها الإشارة positive وهون negative, so that mean increasing decreasing حتكون max. لكن متى حيكون للفانكشن local minimum؟ حيكون للفانكشن local minimum العكس. إذا كانت هي x naught كان عن يسارها f prime negative positive, so the function decreasing then increasing سوف تكون local minimum. So this function increasing decreasing maybe إنه هذا الفانكشن فهاي البوينت حتكون عنا local max. This graph decreasing increasing ولو رسمنا الرسمة هيك, so this point relative minimum. This is the graph for the function f x. maybe هذا الفانكشن g of x. لاحظ this function لأن ال x always increasing. This function has no extremum. No extremum, that mean no max and no minimum. Now, for example, find the intervals on which f increasing, decreasing, and find all critical points and the relative extrema for. The same procedure. كل هدول بإمكانك تجاوب عليهم من خلال f prime. Now, f x equals 3x to the power 4 plus 12x. Before you solve the question, what is domain f x? Obvious, you have polynomial, so domain f x are. Now find f prime x. This is equal 12 x to the power 3 plus 12. Study the sign for f prime. رح أضطر أسويها بالزيرو. So you get 12 x to the power 3 plus 1 equals 0, which is equivalent to x equal minus 1. Now study the sign for f prime. The sign for f prime x. ومن خلالها you can answer what is the critical point. واضح إنه ال critical number minus 1, so the critical point it will be minus 1 and f minus 1. Now study sign f prime. This is minus 1. If you choose number greater than minus 1, like 0, so sign it will be positive. If you choose minus 2, minus 8 plus 1, so negative. So the function decreasing, increasing. Now, the critical point is minus 1 and f minus 1. And this is equal. What is the value for f minus 1? f minus 1 equal 3 minus 12. This is equal minus 9. So the critical point minus 1 minus 9. Okay. f x, لاحظ this critical point decreasing increasing it will be minimum. رح تكون عنا إياها this value is minimum لأنه decreasing increasing. Okay. هتكون also it will be absolute minimum. Now f x increasing on which interval? On minus 1 infinity, and f x decreasing on which interval? On minus infinity minus 1. Why? لأنه الساين ل f prime. If prime negative معناته الفانكشن it will be decreasing. Another example. f x equal x to the power 4 over 3 minus x to the power 1 over 3. Before you solve the question, what is the domain for f x? Domain f x r intersection r, you get real number. To answer the question, you must find f prime x. Now differentiate according to the rules. So f prime x equal 4 over 3 x to the power 4 over 3 minus 1 minus 1 over 3 x to the power 1 over 3 minus 1. We simplify. Before you study the sign of f prime, you must simplify. So this equivalent to 4 over 3 x to the power 4 over 3 minus 1, 1 over 3 minus 1 over 3 x to the power 1 over 3 minus 1 minus 2 over 3. So this is equal 4 over 3 x to the power 1 over 3 minus 1 over 3 x to the power 2 over 3. So f prime x equal نوحد المقامات, take the least common multiple 3x to the power 2 over 3 رح يعطينا 4x. y المقام 1 we multiply by x to the power 2 over 3 minus 1. Now this is f prime lil x. When f prime lil x equals 0, and when f prime, what is the point that make f prime at this point does not exist? Obvious, this is equal 0 if 4x minus 1 equals 0, so you get x equal 1 over 4. What is the critical numbers for f x? واضح, they are x equal 1 over 4 and x equal 0. x equal 1 over 4 since f prime at 1 over 4 equals 0, and x equals 0, since f prime and is 0, not differentiable, and make sure that these points belongs to domain fx. Now, study the sign for f prime x. To study the sign, عنا 0 1/4 هاي f prime. We want to study the sign for f prime. Choose number greater than 1 for like 1. 4 times 1, 4, minus 1, the sign positive, with denominator positive, so sign it will be positive. Okay. If you choose number between 0 and 1/4, like 1/8, so 4 times 1/8, 1/2 minus 1, so the sign negative. If you choose number like -1, -4 minus 1 negative, والcubic root للx square, so the sign negative. Now, if x decreasing on the interval -infinity 1/4, and if x increasing on the interval 1/4 infinity. لاحظ this function decreasing, increasing. So حيكون عندنا local minimum if x has a local minimum at x equal 1/4. If we say at which point, if you want to find the point, it will be 1/4 and if 1/4. لاحظ, it is not necessary every critical point has at this critical point max or minimum. ليس بالضرورة كل critical point إنه يكون عندها minimum or max. Obvious 0 is a critical point, لكن no max and no minimum. Okay. If x equal x minus 3e to the power x, what is the domain for f x? Domain f x r. Why? Domain x minus 3r, domain exponential r intersection r. So find f prime x. f prime x product of two function. x minus 3 في derivative e to the power x plus e to the power x times 1. So this is equal 0. Simplify. Take e to the power x as a common factor. You get x minus 3 plus 1 equal 0. Now, e to the power, so f prime x equal e to the power x times x minus 2. So this is equal 0. E to the power x, never it will be equal 0, so we get x equal 2. So the critical point, what is the critical point? 2 will image let 2 minus 3 minus e square. كيف حصلنا عليها؟ F2 we substitute 2 minus 3 times e square. So we get 2 minus 3 minus 1 minus e square. Now, we want to study the sign for f prime. Now, to study the sign for f prime, this is f prime. To study the sign for f prime, we have 2 is a critical point. Study the sign. Choose number greater than 2 like 3. Obvious, this is always positive. So the sign positive. Why? 3 minus 2 positive. If you choose number less than 2, like 0, so the sign negative. That means if x decreasing on which interval? On minus infinity 2, and if x increasing on the interval to infinity, and this point هيكون للاقتران is a relative minimum. هتكون هي is a relative minimum for the function. Okay. If you take f x equal ln x over x, before you solve the question, what is the domain for f x? Domain f x, what? From 0 to infinity. Why? Domain ln inside ln positive. تقاطع domain x معناته open from 0 to infinity. When you study the sign for f prime, you must study the sign only on this interval. Be careful. Now, find f prime. Apply the rules of differentiation. الquotient, denominator times المقام مشتقة البسط 1 over x minus في derivative للx over x square. This equivalent to 1 minus ln over x square. Now, when f prime equals 0, أكيد أي كسر حيساوي صفر if 1 minus ln x equals 0, that means 1 equal ln x, so this equivalent x equal e. Now, to study the sign for f prime x, this is f prime. We want to study the sign for f prime. To study the sign for f prime of x, be careful, we study the sign on its domain from 0 to infinity. Now, if you choose number greater than e, لاحظ إنه denominator always positive. If we choose number greater than e, like e to the power 3, substitute. If you choose e to the power 3, what is the sign? 1 minus ln e to the power 3, this equivalent 1 minus 3 ln e, so minus 2, so the sign negative. الساين رح تكون negative. So the sign negative. Now, if you choose number between 0 and e, like 1, ln 1, if you choose 1, if you choose 1, ln 1 0, so 1 minus 0, positive, 1 positive. So, what is the critical point? The critical point E and F E. F E, لن E 1, 1 over E. How we get 1 over E? This is F E. We substitute لن E over E. Now, F X increasing on which interval? On open interval 0e. Why open? Since it is not included in the domain. And f x decreasing on the interval E infinity, and this point it will be max, local max. Okay, if we take the function f of x equal x plus 3 over x minus 2, what is domain f of x? Rational function r intersection r except 2 before you solve. Now find f prime x. According to the rules, the denominator مقام مشتقة البسط 1 minus x plus 3 في الديريفاتيف ل x minus 2 1 divided by the denominator square. This equivalent x minus 2 minus x minus 3 divided by, so you get f prime x equal minus 2 over x minus 2 square. Now, f prime never equal to 0. And f prime lil x always negative. Why? The denominator always positive. فواضح إنه f prime lil x less than 0 always for all x in the domain of the function minus infinity to, لاحظ this function sign ل f prime this is 2 not included in the domain لكن الساين ل f prime always negative. That means the function decreasing on which interval? On minus infinity 2 and 2 infinity. Is there any critical point for the function f of x? No. So f of x has no critical points. And f of x has no extremum. ما حيكون له لا max ولا minimum. و f of x decreasing على فترتين اللي هم from minus infinity to and to infinity. لو قلنا f of x decreasing on r غلط. It's wrong since the domain r except 2. And this function later on رح نرسمه حيكون له horizontal and vertical asymptote. To practice more, حاول إنك تحل two functions f of x equal x في e to the power x square and f of x equal x to the power 3 لن x. First of all, the domain for this function r. And the domain for this function, what? You have len. The domain, it will be from 0 to infinity, product of two functions. This function domain r and this function from 0 to infinity, the intersection إلهم 0 to infinity. So you must differentiate and study the sign for f prime of x. آخر ملاحظة بدنا نحكيها بمحاضرة اليوم، احنا شفنا ليس بالضرورة انه كل critical point انه يكون عندها max or minimum. Maybe the function has a critical point, لكن at this critical point no max and no minimum. But suppose that f is a function defined on an open interval containing the point x naught. If f has a relative extremum at x equal x naught, إذا كان للفunction له relative extremum at x equal x naught, that means relative extremum maybe إنه يكون max or minimum. إذا كان له relative extremum then فهاي فقط in this direction, then x equal x naught is a critical point. شو يعني critical point؟ معناه هذا الكلام إنه إما f prime لل x naught equal 0 or f prime لل x naught does not exist. لكن الكونفرس not true. يعني بهاي الطريقة ما بيمشي الوضع. ليس بالضرورة إنه every critical point يكون عندها max or minimum. And we see من الإكزامبل اللي حليناهم إنه we find the critical point but this critical point has no max or minimum. A simple example, if you take the function f of x equal x to the power 3, this function has a critical point 0, 0. Why? If you differentiate 3x squared equals 0, but this critical point no max عندها و no minimum. يعني إذا كانت critical point maybe إنه يكون عندها max or minimum, maybe not. لاحظ إنه f prime لل x equal 3x squared always positive, so the function increasing, so no max no minimum. إن شاء الله في المحاضرة القادمة حنكمل بناء على هاي النوت ونحل example وحندرس خصائص أكتر للفانكشن. حنعرف what do we mean about concavity. So we study in this lecture 3 concepts. What do we mean about a critical point? What do we mean about increasing, decreasing function? And what do we mean about relative extremum? And in order to find the critical point, the intervals of increasing, decreasing, the extremum, كلهم بيتم الإجابة عليهم to study the sign for f prime ال x.